Hey Care Portal team members, the purpose of this video is to provide a quick reminder on this new process that you all are seeing take place called escalation. Church point people, coordinators, and regional managers have all started seeing in their inbox new emails with the subject line that starts with that giant word, escalation. If you're a regional manager, you recently entered into your regional manager interface on our website and set parameters. You set parameters for the maximum number of churches that would receive a request. You set the maximum mile radius that you wanted that request to extend to. And then you also selected those same two things for the escalation process. The escalation process is after a request has already been submitted and gone to the initial max number of churches in the initial max radius. If nobody has responded, then after a certain period of time, depending on the level of urgency of that request, a new set of churches will receive that same request, and the mile radius and the number of churches will escalate. For example, we're going to look at these counties in Missouri to see what this means and how it works. So when you entered in the maximum number of churches and the maximum mile radius that you wanted a request to go to in a specific county, a couple of different things could happen. Let's look at Cass County as an example. So what's set here is the maximum number of churches that can receive any request posted in Cass County is 20 total. The max mile radius it can go out is 15 miles. A couple of things can happen here. One is that request can go out 15 miles and maybe there's only 8 churches within a 15-mile radius of where that was posted. So it's only going to hit 8 churches because it's going to cut it off at that 15-mile radius. Or conversely, what could happen is there could be 40 churches in a 15-mile radius, but it's going to cut it off at that first 20 because you set that as the maximum number of churches that you wanted it to go to. So that's what happens when the initial request gets sent out. If there are no responses in a certain amount of time, depending on the level of urgency, this new process called escalation allows more churches to be notified of the need, and this is how that works. If the request was listed as urgent, 24 hours later, the escalation email will go out to additional churches, depending on what's been set here in each county. If the request was set as a high need, the escalation email won't be sent out until 48 hours later. So it'll give those initial churches 48 hours to respond before more churches are invited into it. If the request was set at normal level of urgency, it'll wait 120 hours. So the initial churches will have that amount of time to respond. And if they don't in that amount of time, then new churches will be invited in to help meet this request. When that escalation email goes out, it is not going to be resent to any of the original churches that got it. So here's where a little math comes into play. So in this particular county, the escalation max churches is 40. So the total number of churches that will ever receive this request is 40. So when it first goes out, only up to 20 churches will receive it. But if none of those 20 churches responds, an additional 20 churches will be notified if they fall in the additional 15 miles of the max radius. So these numbers here are totals. It's not adding 40 more churches to the 20 that already received it, and it's not adding 30 more miles to the 15-mile radius that it already went to. Those are both total number of miles and churches that will receive it at all. So it's only 20 additional churches that will get notified in only a 15-mile radius additionally outside of the 15 miles that already went. I'm going to give you 2 hypothetical examples, one that's relatively easy to figure out and one that's a little bit more difficult, and hopefully that will answer your questions for how exactly this is working. So let's say there are 22 churches in a 15-mile radius of a need that gets posted in Cass County. So only 20 of those 22 churches are going to receive it. Even though it reached all the way out that 15-mile radius, the 2 churches that are just on the edge of that radius or that are furthest away, they won't receive the initial email because this was set to cut it off at 20 churches total. It was an urgent request. So within 24 hours, none of those 20 churches responded. And so now an escalation email will get sent out and it will say escalation at the beginning of the subject line. So that next email, the escalation email, will be sent out 15 additional miles to the churches that it already hit. So it cut it off at that 15-mile radius the first time it went out, and now it's going to start at that 15-mile radius and go 15 miles further. But first, it has to include the 2 that were within the 15-mile radius that weren't included that first time. So those 2 churches will be the first on the list to get the escalation email, and then it will add any other churches up to 20 more additional. So for a total of 40 churches that received the request at any time, whether initially or through the second escalation email. Here's what that escalation email looks like in a church point person's inbox. It just has that giant word ahead of it, but everything else is the same in the subject line. So it still has the request number. It still tells you the level of urgency. The request still looks exactly the same. And the way you respond, you can either respond, send a message to the active community, or look for the churches nearest the need, which is a great feature when you're escalating, because a church that's maybe 30 miles out can help a church that's 1 mile out from this need by seeing who is the closest church to this need using the See Churches button. One more example just to hopefully answer other questions that might come up about this process. So let's now hypothetically say there's actually 50 churches within a 15-mile radius of a need that gets posted. So there's just a plethora of churches in this community. It's everything we've hoped and dreamed. The request is going to get sent out, and it's going to cut it off at those closest 20. So it'll look at the zip code, and it'll just do those churches that are closest to the need up to 20. So those additional 30 churches that are enrolled within the 15-mile radius, they're not going to see the initial request. This particular hypothetical request is a normal level of urgency. So 120 hours later, an escalation email will be sent out to 20 more churches, but they will all still be within that initial 15-mile radius, because this won't even matter since, as I said, there's actually 50 total churches in a 15-mile radius, but the first request cut it off at those closest 20, and so the second time it'll go out to the escalation, it'll go to the next closest 20. So there'll still be 10 churches that don't ever see the request within a 15-mile radius simply because of how that falls. And again, all of this is hypothetical. I don't really know that there's actually any area that has 50 churches within a 15-mile radius, but I sure hope there is. We just really want our team to fully understand this process so that they can better equip churches to understand what these requests are that they're getting and why they might be getting requests that are a little further out than they thought they were getting them. If you have any questions regarding this process, please reach out to me anytime, and we'll explain as much as we possibly can so that you feel equipped to be able to encourage your churches to meet as many needs as they can, to work with churches that are closest to the need, to be that relational face, and to really just be able to share resources. Thanks, guys.